Well, welcome back, everyone. The first panel was excellent. And now welcome to panel 2, Contributions of the International Space Station over 20 plus years. The moderator of the panel is Courtney McMillan. Courtney's an aerospace engineer who started at NASA's Johnson Space Center in 1996 as a contractor on the flight control team, supporting shuttle Mir operations and ISS development and assembly. She then joined the ISS program's Moscow Technical Liaison Office as a civil servant and subsequently progressed into increasingly responsible roles supporting human spaceflight operations for ISS and the Flight Operations Directorate. In 2007, she was selected and certified as a flight director and chose the team name Tranquility. Ms. McMillan currently serves as manager for the Mission Integration and Operations Office in the ISS program. I think this is going to be a great panel, and I hand things over to our distinguished moderator and panelists.
All right, good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Contributions of the International Space Station over 20 plus years panel. As Jeff said, my name is Courtney McMillan. I've spent over 20 years working with ISS operations, first as a flight controller, including about 12 years as a flight director. Everyone on this panel has seen the impact of ISS on our world from in many different ways through the decades of operation, as well as the decade that preceded operation for development of the partnership. This is a group with a unique set of vantage points across the breadth of ISS assembly, operations, and research. I'm honored to be here with all of you. And I'm excited to get into the discussion. So we'll go ahead and start. I'm going to introduce each of the panelists. They'll have a few minutes to talk, and then we'll move on to each of the next panelists. So first up, we have Dr. Leroy Chow. He was educated as a chemical engineer and spent 15 years as a NASA astronaut, flying 4 missions on space shuttles, a Russian Soyuz spacecraft, and aboard ISS, where he served as the Expedition 10 commander and NASA science officer. He logged nearly 230 days in space altogether and executed 6 spacewalks in both American and Russian spacesuits. Since leaving NASA, he has worked in business, aerospace consulting, and technology startup, as well as at the National Space Biomedical Research Institute. Dr. Chow holds appointments at the Baylor College of Medicine and Rice University. Leroy, take it away.
Great. Well, thanks, Courtney. It's really an honor to be a part of this panel and again to be back at ISMS this year. Definitely looking forward to when we can actually have a live meeting, but in the meantime, I think these do pretty well. So ISS, ISS was the biggest part of my spaceflight career and probably most of the people attending this conference. ISS is the most audacious construction project ever envisioned and actually executed. And one of the big surprises of all of us working on ISS at the time was just how relatively smoothly it went together. We had a few hiccups, but we really certainly expected a lot more bigger hiccups. And the partnership is something that has endured, even with different political things going around in the world. That was one thing that was observed by the Return to Review of Human Spaceflight Plans Committee back in 2009, of which I was a part, was this international partnership that was formed, this framework that has endured, bringing former Cold War enemies and World War II enemies together to actually work together on this project and work together so well. And that partnership, of course, continues today across to our exploration program. And so I'm really happy to be a part of this panel. As you all know, space station is an integral component of the exploration program, serving not only as an engineering testbed, but also as a biomedical countermeasures testbed. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Courtney. Thanks.
All right, thanks, Leroy. Let's see, next up we have Michael Lopez Alegria. He currently serves as the chief astronaut at Axiom Space. He has spent 275 days in space over 5 missions, 3 space shuttle flights, a Russian Soyuz for his stint as ISS commander for Expedition 14, and on SpaceX's Crew Dragon as commander of the AX-1 mission, the first fully private mission to ISS. He holds NASA records for the most extravehicular activities and cumulative spacewalk time. He is the former president of the Commercial Spaceflight Federation and has served on numerous advisory boards and committees. Michael.
Hey, Courtney, good to be with you and the rest of the group here on this panel. Some of us are very familiar with each other, having flown on one of the very early ISS assembly missions. That's Bill and Leroy. It seems like we've come an awful long way since then. I think we just went through 22 years of continued inhabitants on the ISS, and that's clearly an impressive milestone. I'd like to focus my remarks on the future of ISS and note that it is limited. It is an amazing platform, as I'm sure you'll hear throughout the sessions today and on other days, but it is a machine, and as such, it's going to wear out someday. And we learned some lessons pretty hard when the shuttle retired in 2011, and we didn't have commercial crew capability until 11 years later, sorry, 9 years later in 2020. That's probably something we cannot afford to repeat in terms of a destination in low Earth orbit to continue to conduct this microgravity research that's so important. And so just as it has historically been the role of governments to open new frontiers, and then, once it is determined to be safe, to let commerce come in and establish a marketplace, so it is today in low Earth orbit. We've been going there for 60 years. I would never say it's easy, nor is it routine, but it is regular and it is reliable and it is safe. And so it's now time for the governments to move on to, I'll say, bigger, better, and more difficult things, which obviously a return to the moon is in that, as is onto Mars, and that let commercial companies establish a foothold and eventually make a real economy in low Earth orbit. And that is exactly what Axiom and other companies that are competing in the commercial LEO development program intend to do. When the ISS is retired, Axiom at least intends to have an orbital space station once we detach from the ISS. And we want to make that as seamless a transition as possible. So we avoid the gap that we had between the shuttle and commercial crew. You can imagine that if you're a researcher and NASA takes a decision along with the other partners to deorbit the ISS in a couple of years, because it can't be done, on the eve of the deorbit. If you have no place to do your research, you're going to start losing interest and spending your resources elsewhere, and we just can't afford to have that in the research community. So I look forward to continued ISS exploitation of microgravity for the foreseeable future, but at some point, whenever that time comes, the commercial industry will be ready to take over and take the baton. Thanks, Courtney.
Thanks, Michael. Next, we have William Shepard. He was selected to train as a NASA astronaut in 1984 after serving in the Navy's underwater demolition and SEAL teams. He flew 3 space shuttle flights before serving as program manager and deputy program manager for the International Space Station. In 1996, he was named to lead the first expedition crew to ISS, and in 2000, Captain Shepard and his 2 Russian crewmates launched from Kazakhstan on a Soyuz rocket, and 22 years ago yesterday, they opened the hatch and arrived to start their 141 days at ISS and starting permanent human operations on board the new station. Captain Shepard retired from NASA in 2001 and is currently a senior researcher with the Stevens Institute in Hoboken, New Jersey. Captain Shepard.
Thank you, Courtney. It doesn't seem like 22 years, but I guess it is. I'm looking at many old faces on the screen here. Real quickly, I think in retrospect, ISS has given us, at least at the outset, it was a chance to revisit the early days of our space exploration culture. We had very limited comms. We had kind of a forced autonomy from mission control on the ground. And I think we're going to see that culture emerge again fairly soon, probably on lunar expeditions and certainly going to Mars. One of the other legacies that I think has been started, and I'm not sure how well it's been sustained. The space station program was a big integration job. There are many aspects of that were physical and technically functional, but also there was a a cultural, kind of like an ops culture integration aspect to it that was pushed very strongly. And I don't know that that persists, but this is something, again, that's going to be essential in the long run for partners and countries to do space things. And I hope that we have a way to preserve and embrace those needs. One thing that bothers me about where we're at today in the global context of space exploration is NASA and the US seems to relearn how to do space about every 20 years. And we've done this with the Apollo program, the shuttle program, and I think we're going to do it again with ISS. And so I don't believe we place enough emphasis on capturing what we know about how to do space and basically cherishing and buffing up the knowledge that we have gained. And I think much of the business of flying a rocket to space and coming back on a winged vehicle and how do you train and simulate and manage crews who are ready to do that, I think we've lost a big part of that. In summary, I think what I think ISS represents over the past 22 years, I see it as a blueprint for a Mars exploration. We're going to have multiple paths to supply the logistics and probably a lot of the systems on board, communications, life support, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The space station has proven the need for all of that. We're going to have a much stronger interest in being able to fix and maintain things up in space. We don't have enough emphasis on that now. And the biggest thing that I see is that particularly working with the Russians and their hardware, we have to recognize that simplicity has its own value. And I don't think we've put enough emphasis on that. Courtney, back to you.
All right, thank you, Bill. Next up, we have Professor Yelena Fomina. She is the head of the Department of Physiology of Human Gravitational Resistance and Laboratory of Countermeasures to Negative Effects of Weightlessness at the Institute of Biomedical Problems of the Russian Academy of Sciences. Her team ensures that the cosmonauts on board ISS can maintain physical performance during their time in microgravity. Professor Fomina's research focuses on cardiovascular demands and the effects of in-flight exercise countermeasures on cardiorespiratory kinetics. She has led research on simulated interplanetary missions, such as Mars 500 and Sirius, with wide international cooperation. Professor Fomina is the author of more than 200 scientific publications and is a full member of the International Academy of Astronautics on the Board of Trustees, and she chairs the Life Sciences Committee. Professor Fomina.
Dear friends, I'm really happy to see everybody of you because usually in this time we have opportunity to meet together, and autumn for me it is time for meeting in Houston, and I'm really hope that next time we will be meet face to face and speak about ISS and another our medical problems faced during our summit. And in order to be sure that we understand each other when we speak about ISS, I have to tell that ISS, first of all, is the lab. It is a lab for preparation for Moon and Martian mission. And that's why all scientists all over the world try to use this lab for experiments, for on-board experiments, and it is absolutely right because we have a great opportunity on ground experiment. But when we think about weightlessness, which will be during our exploration mission, we could not modulate it on ISS in proper way. and we have to tell it now. That's why for us, ISS, first of all, it is a lab for our experiment, and this 20 years help us understand some process, some physiological process on the human beings, which help us to be ready for exploration mission. And now we have experiments which modulate, for example, model task or during EVA on the surface. And we done it with at unloading situation. And now we can tell that our efforts are success, because after long-term mission, our cosmonaut can fulfill this task very successful, and we can tell that our exercise programs, that our countermeasure, that we are ready for long mission, and of course we are ready for short mission. And now we think, to my mind, I suppose that another results of our ISS exploration is that we are ready to use ISS for tourism, and maybe for not for commercial purposes, but also for science, because we have experience when producer and artists have short flight on ISS, and they prepare film. We will see it next year, and it's mean for us that it is possible to send to ISS not professional but ordinary people. Of course, it was great selection, but it is opportunity for ordinary people to to realize their dreams. And maybe it is one of the results of our exploration, that somebody, of course, there are on this panel astronauts take part, but of course, for a lot of human beings dream about flight into space. And this 20 years of exploration shows that it can be realized. And maybe sometime scientists will flow to ISS and have opportunity to done it, a non-professional astronaut or cosmonaut. And of course, I absolutely agree with my friends who tell that ISS is a platform for friendship, because on ISS, astronaut and cosmonaut have in ordinary life, they have opportunity to have dinner together, to spend a lot of time together, and it is example for us that even during this turbulence time on ISS, it is peace. And I suppose that it is maybe great results of ISS. Thank you.
Thank you, Yelena. Next up is Bill MacArthur. Bill MacArthur's career spanned 48 years as an Army aviator and NASA astronaut. He is a veteran of 4 spaceflights, including 6 months on board ISS as the Expedition 12 commander and NASA science officer. Following his last flight, Bill served as manager of the Space Shuttle Safety and Mission Assurance Office, manager of the Orbiter Project Office, and director of Safety and Mission Assurance for the Johnson Space Center. Bill.
Thanks, Courtney. Gosh, it is such a delight to join the group today, and because they are, somebody mentioned the word old. I'm going to refer to us as old friends, but anyhow, with that qualifier. And what we haven't touched on, and I feel uniquely unqualified to do so, but one of certainly the great accomplishments of ISS over the past, if we talk about prior to Shep's crew getting up there, and we were talking more like 24 years, is just the extraordinary diversity of basic and practical research. And, of course, we know in the life sciences area, I was just reading that they're testing things that I'd never even heard of, biomining for one. And then some of the contemporary nature of the research. When the pandemic set in, who could imagine that we actually could do research on board ISS in response to something, to do that research so quickly, but sure enough, we had crews testing the behavior of remdesivir on orbit. And so, of course, one of the reasons for having ISS is so we can better understand the impacts of microgravity on astronaut health and potential mitigation, because we really do want to travel beyond Earth, low Earth orbit, and certainly ISS is going to facilitate that. Having been on ISS pretty early, it's been just extraordinary to see some of the accomplishments in the technology development area. I just love when I speak to school children to talk about water recycling. And when you explain it, and I like to tell them that the water that they used to make their coffee today was the same water that they'd used to prepare their coffee a couple of weeks earlier, and pause a little bit and wait for that to sink in. But those are the trees. And so I'd really like to maybe take a look at the forest and not focus on the trees. As I think Elena mentioned, that she alluded to the fact that ISS is probably every bit as extraordinary a political achievement as it is an engineering achievement, having brought just a multitude of countries together to achieve a common goal. Often when when these same countries have competing interests here on the ground. But when we talk about on the ground, I think one of the most extraordinary things from ISS is that with the continuous presence of human beings in space, is that a majority of people now graduating from college have never known a time when people didn't live and work in space uninterrupted. I might suggest that over 22 years of ISS crewed operations, 22 uninterrupted years in which people have lived off our home planet, has had a subtle yet profound impact on humanity's view of ourselves. I think we see both ourselves and Earth differently. I think many of us are familiar with Frank White's book, The Overview Effect. And I think there's been a similar overview effect that has also spread to humanity in general. I was kind of surprised to read that a few recent suborbital flyers described their experience somewhat negatively, as that their experience with the overview effect was I think a feeling of sadness, of futility, and certainly that's legitimate. But I think instead, for most of us, ISS, knowing that our fellow human beings can live for an extended period of time away from Mother Earth, that we really are truly embracing the concept that the sky actually is not the limit.
Thanks, Bill. All right, next up is Dr. Michael Barrett. He is a NASA astronaut and physician with a particular interest in adaptive physiology and human performance associated with weightlessness and fractional gravity. He began his career at Johnson Space Center as a project physician and flight surgeon in 1991, was selected into the NASA astronaut class of 2000, and has flown to ISS twice, first on a Russian Soyuz for expeditions 19 and 20, and again on STS-133, the final flight for Space Shuttle Discovery. He has worked heavily with NASA's Commercial Crew and Artemis programs in applying medical standards to new vehicle design and operations, and is currently assigned to the SpaceX Dragon Crew 8 mission to ISS in 2024. He is the senior editor of the textbook Principles of Clinical Medicine for Spaceflight and teaches space medicine for a number of academic programs. Mike.
All right, thanks, Courtney. I did see, it's great to be amongst old friends, as Bill mentioned. I did see a couple of eyebrows raised when you mentioned that I was going back to space station on Crew 8. I can only say that Russia is not the only entity that recycles old but reliable flight hardware, and I think we've proven that as a successful model. It is really good to be here. Thank you, George Abbey, again, for convening this group. And I'm also really sorry we can't be together so we can look one another in the eye. One of the best things about ISMS is the exchange of ideas and feelings and thoughts. And I would just say that by this time, after a couple of years of pandemic living, we should be pretty candid with our online conversations. I mean, most of us know each other's dogs and a lot of our kids. So it's a little challenge to the virtual audience. Don't hold back. Say what you think, ask what you want to know, and we will do our best to answer candidly. So my comments, just to start with, come from my perspective as a medical guy and a crew member, and I'll try to say some of the things that the other folks didn't say, because I agree with every one of them. There are a lot of us here that really are still active in the operations or the discussion of ISS that really have a birth kinship with it. And when Space Station Freedom basically died as a program, we started working with our Russian counterparts and started dipping our toes into the waters of long duration flight. And I was one of many who were huddling in Crystal City, Virginia, in these what seemed to be endless planning meetings at the time, talking about the rudiments of the International Space Station in the wake of Space Station Freedom going away, and really realizing what a partnership with Russia and adding that to the rest of the world could do for us. And my aspect was more the medical sciences version, but I remember what we considered and the vision for science and retooling the international community to this new project. It was hard. It was very hard, actually. And from a science standpoint, there was a strong notion that we would just do cutting edge research, and that if we spent the money and built this, we would discover cures for cancer and new industrial processes, that killer app, as we now call it. But there really wasn't a real or detailed articulation of what that pathway would look like. It was kind of a build it and they will come, or build it and this will happen mentality. And maybe that was right for the time. It got us over the hump and we built this platform. And at the time, the ISS program was meant just to run through 2015, I believe. But if you fast forward to now, interesting when you compare what we first discussed in the 90s, the ISS has vastly exceeded our initial vision, and I would say our imagination in its build. When you look at the science capabilities and the throughput, and I would just posit that doesn't happen in the aerospace world very often. Usually it's the other way around. We descope, we take things out, we realize a little bit less than we wanted to. That hasn't happened with ISS. And we've gone from questioning whether there would be enough science to do on board to having major backlogs. And I will just call it fly-off anxiety because there's so much to do before the end of station. Prioritizing that and getting the answers we need is going to be very difficult. So I echo Mike L.A.'s comments about the utility and the critical need, I would say, for next generation stations. And now we're at a time where crew time basically is the limiting factor for science throughput. So what we now see in the form of a thriving and I would say incredibly well-equipped laboratory with so many sea miles on it is really quite amazing. Now, some of you may remember I ran the human research program for about a year and a half. It was one of the most traumatic times of my life. However, it was very interesting. It was an amazing staff. And I became extremely familiar with the strategic fly-off plan that we had. And that was basically exploration forward. It still is. But what strikes me is how we've had to change that plan because of new discoveries, many of these on the ISS. From a medical standpoint, I think about the neuroophthalmic syndrome and all of its correlates, which are vast. Other things like we've discovered changes in the way venous circulation is regulated, thrombosis, which is the tendency of the blood to clot. These are things that we didn't see, we didn't recognize, but they were right under our noses all this time. And the reason we see them is because we have accumulated long duration flight and because we have a really well-equipped laboratory with robust tools on board to characterize them. I'll just plant a bug that characterizing the microbiome of humans and the spaceflight environment is really exciting and really starting to return results as well. As are all things omics, genomics, proteomics, transcriptomics. We've talked about that in other ISMS conferences, but these are powerful tools that are, again, very exploration enabling that are going to serve us well in the future, but have to be developed on ISS. One quick version, a couple of years ago, we had just come out with the third edition of our textbook, which was Principles of Clinical Medicine for Spaceflight. I'm sorry, second edition. This is it. It's awfully big. And this is not self-serving because it's me and 80 of my closest friends, and we don't make a dime off it, of course. Point being that second edition was 400 and some pages longer than the first, and it's tiny print, and that was all International Space Station. And since then, these last 2 years, that book has been accessed and downloaded over 30,000 times. Now, when you think about who practices space medicine or with whom does it intersect, that seems a really high number. It seems a little bit off in a way. But what it does reflect is, I would say, a growing interest and recognition of the value of this really rapidly evolving knowledge base and understanding, and the interest in space medicine basically as an enabler of human knowledge. And space medicine is a really small piece of the overall pie. You know, what this tells me is that there is probably a really large pyramid out there of knowledge and interest with the International Space Station at the top of it. And the base is broad, but not very well appreciated because we don't track this as science output. We don't track this as utilization, I guess is the word we use. So I think there is an outsized effect of the ISS that is really hard for us to understand, but is very real. And we encounter it as we go out and talk to people. And I think just by the way, we're on the cusp of this new space economy in low Earth orbit, thanks largely to ISS is paving the way. I will close with saying, and these are lessons we learned the hard way, there is a geopolitical landscape, which arguably is centuries old. There's a much newer astropolitical landscape, and there is considerable overlap, but it's a not complete overlap on the Venn diagram. The astropolitical landscape has a life of its own, and it can sustain activity beyond the former. And in that realm, we really need to think about the long game, where a project like the ISS survives the peaks and troughs of the geopolitical landscape. So when you think about the ISS is well into its third decade, the ISS is the part of that long game. And I would argue it's the center of it. I think, like the shuttle, the ISS will be a very highly recognizable icon of spaceflight, but unlike the shuttle, of international cooperation, I think for probably many generations, honestly. And I would leave us with just saying that maintaining that relationship in adversity is difficult, but it's nowhere near as hard as starting over. So thanks, Courtney.
Awesome. All right. So that completes all the initial remarks from the panelists. We have a few questions prepared to start some conversation. So we'll get started with those. For the folks that are online, if you have questions for us, you can put them either in the Q&A or in the chat, and we'll read them to the panelists as we go. Once we get through a couple of the ones that I warned them were coming. So we'll start with one of the ones I warned you guys about. If I had known then what I know now. So all of us have worked on ISS or worked on ISS for extended periods of time. What aspects of ISS, how we operate it, how we do research on board, would have surprised you back when we were putting the plans together in those endless meetings that Mike was talking about? I'm going to go back in the order and start with Leroy on this one.
Yeah, so one of the things that was surprising, I mentioned briefly in my remarks, was just how smoothly ISS construction proceeded. There were so many complicated mechanisms. There was this wall of EVA and lack of experience doing EVAs that we were really concerned that things would go smoothly. And so we did have a few hiccups in space. One of the things that comes to mind is during EVA is when we had a ammonia release, some problems with the QDs during lab install, and that was kind of a big deal. And a few more issues with solar arrays, but we got through all of that. So I think that was the biggest surprise with such a complex vehicle, such complex mechanisms. When you look at the common berthing mechanisms, I mean, we all used to kind of shake our heads, say, is this thing really going to work? And you find a mechanism that has more stuff on it, but it's been working great, and tribute to the engineers and the people who put it all together. So that to me was the biggest surprise, was just knowing what I know now. We really can create and build such a complicated vehicle.
Courtney, you look frozen.
Yeah, I think we think Courtney froze up. Uh-oh.
While they're sorting that out, I think I was next. And when I was saying, I'm riffing a little bit off what Shep said, I feel like we have crept a bit in the involvement of MCC in sort of day-to-day ops. And some of that is to the good. I think an example, although we operators don't love it, is that they do a lot of robotic operations now. Sometimes the crew doesn't even know they're going to happen unless they pay attention to the timeline when they're doing small remove and replace outside the ISS, for example. And that obviously is good because doing an EVA is time consuming and complicated, and it really clobbers the science timeline in and around that period. But on the other hand, I feel like there is a lot of involvement of MCC that is not necessary, or at least doesn't seem so as a crew member. And I admit, Courtney, if you are back, that we definitely do not have as big a picture as MCC has. But just intuitively, I feel like we would be well served by a little bit more autonomy on board in terms of timeline activities and sometimes payload activities, things going through Marshall Space Flight Center, which is where the Payload Operations Center is located, sometimes seems to add a layer of communication that might not be necessary. And as the crew size grows, the communications grows. When I was on board during AX1, there were 11 of us on the ISS, and many trying to talk to Marshall at the same time over a limited number of channels, and it was quite challenging at times. The other thing I'd say in the interest automation is that today, with the processing speeds and the advantages of the increases in capacity of IT, we are moving in the direction of more automated response to FIDR, which is fault detection, isolation, and recovery, which I think is a good thing. I think we should continue to push in that direction. Certainly, future space stations should take advantage of that. The Crew Dragon, for example, has a lot of that built in. And so these taking advantage of automation and dare I say some limited AI, I think is probably a good thing. I'm going to mute myself and see whoever is next.
I'll jump in since nobody's grabbed the mic. The biggest thing, if I had to think about it and do it over again, what surprised me the most about flying on our expedition was after about a month in space, it was really kind of way out of the front of my mind that we're even in space doing something unusual. I mean, it just seemed like another day on ISS, and I was kind of really surprised that our sense of what was normal had gotten to that extreme. They were up there zinging around, and this is just, it is what it is. I found that psychologically very interesting and something that I didn't expect. And I think that bodes well for people who go to the moon and maybe off to Mars, because I think conceptually it's something that humans will accept and do well. And I'm going to mute my mic for the next person.
So give me a microphone and a captive audience, and I'm really happy. But sort of drawing on this what Shep just said about it's that difference where especially those of us who had short-term flight experience, short duration flight experience, and then experienced a long duration mission. It's something that you maybe on an intellectual level expect to happen, but then when it really does, it really you almost revel in the fact that you have gone from visiting space to living in space, and so something, and I kind of knew it at the time when. Sort of at the last minute, Valeria and I wound up stepping back from being a part of a 3-person crew to being part of a 2-person crew. But I just have a difficult time even now conceptualizing what it would be like to be on orbit with 10 other people, and not just having not just with a crew transfer. I mean, with the AX-1 mission, LA, I think you guys thought you would be there a week, and it turned out to be 2 weeks. And so, I mean, that's 11 people in the same spacecraft for 2 weeks. And then when you weren't there, that's 7 people in the same spacecraft for months. And I almost cannot imagine what that would be like, but I bet it's pretty darn cool. I thoroughly enjoyed being on orbit with Valery Tokarev. I don't think it was an accident we flew together. I think in particular, the Russians felt that we would be very compatible. We were, and we are. But I bet it's really cool to be up there for a long period of time with a whole gang of people.
Maybe I'll add.
Mike, I would like to tell only a few words about that. I fully agree with Michael, who tells that for me it was surprise that for our cosmonaut and maybe for astronaut, as I understand now, it is they would like to have more autonomy than they have now. As I understand, it was great task to organize connection during all time with ISS in order to have opportunity to connect it with astronaut and cosmonaut all time. But then I understand that it is not necessary for them to have or full-time control. And it is interesting that we have the same situation during our isolation. When we have experiment with Mars 500, it was period when we simulate autonomy mission, and it was few days without mission control supervisor. And then when they switch on and again have control, have connection with mission control center, they understand that our volunteers did not want connected with them. They're absolutely autonomy. And I suppose that it was one of our results from ISS is when we try to organize this connection during whole period of time, and then for our cosmonaut and astronaut, it is not necessary. They absolutely they can do everything by themselves. And I have my experiment on board of ISS, and this is very complicated experiment. And all our guys who are not surgeons, who are not physicians, they done it very well. And my colleagues who supervise this experiment at the Mission Control Center, they sometimes they spend here 2 hours and have not any question from on board, because they're absolutely good in all operation, and it is means that that we really prepared for autonomy mission, and it is really it is very exciting. Mike, I'm sorry that I interrupt you.
No worries. On autonomy, I look at it from two aspects. One as a crew member who likes to be left alone, and one as an operator who's performing an experiment that is years in the making and millions of dollars in the production. And it may be an experiment that I saw briefly or was never trained on. I'm reading a procedure that is well written. However, it is definitely subject to interpretation, and the stakes are very high on this. And so I look at autonomy as something that has to be distributed. For big picture, control of the crew, control of the spacecraft, autonomy is good. But part of the reason that station has increased in its productivity is because we have this real-time guidance for some of these experiments, and that is our mission, is to do science. And I will just tell you personally, it's pretty exciting to be in real-time communication with an investigator, a lead investigator on a really exciting experiment, knowing you're about to be among the first to see brand new results and experiencing that excitement with them. And so I think the capabilities we have to enable that real-time comm have indeed proven extremely effective and extremely productive. Maybe an index of that is there's now many papers published with crew members as co-investigators on science that they'd never even thought of before they flew. So I just want to be careful as we use the word autonomy that we scale it appropriately. The mission of ISS is to be a productive laboratory, and we're trying to get as much out of it as we can. Everything changes when you go into an exploration venue. And then I think autonomy takes a much greater front seat.
Yeah, Mike, if I could add a word or two, I think you hit the nail on the head. I mean, the sort of there are different types of space exploration, and where you really need autonomy is in the transit. When you go from, in this case, Earth to ISS, or if you're going from Earth to the moon, you really need the autonomy in the transportation phase. But once you get to your destination, where it's not as dynamic, where a malfunction isn't time critical. So you have a you have a switch fail on board ISS. Well, the ISS isn't going to fall out of the sky, and so clearly in that case, as you said, the utilization is the justification. I mean, it's going up there and gaining knowledge is paramount. And so therefore, whatever you can do to enhance that productivity, because again, the response to something unexpected isn't normally time critical. But now we talk about spending months between Earth and the orbit of Mars. And so now, and again, the time delay becomes really drives you to a requirement that the crew has to be able to operate independently from the ground. Certainly, with as LA had alluded to earlier, And we certainly want to have smart systems, systems that really complement and assist the crew in dealing with anything that's unforeseen.
Yeah, I think we've all had that love-hate reaction when the ground calls and say, hey, there's a pencil free flying over your right shoulder. And you're thinking first, thanks. And then, holy crap, are you watching me that close? But
one thing we got to be very careful of when we go into this new era of AI, we cannot fundamentally understand how the machine comes to its decisions. The machine can't tell us, and the machine can't even replicate the path that it went through to get to that result. And so our ability to basically trust what is going on is really going to be critical. And I see it as it can be a very dangerous evolution in the way that we build and control things if we're not careful.
HAL 2000.
No HAL 2000. We're writing a flight rule about that. There will not be a HAL 2000. Let's see. We're getting some good questions from our participants. So I'm going to start. There's a question for Mike Barrett. We haven't solved SANS yet, but as we refocus from ISS for the moon, where the missions will be shorter, do you think there's a risk that we will lose the driving urgency to solve this risk?
Wow, that's an easy question. So, I think one of the biggest steps with SANS is recognition, and you're absolutely right, Dury. We haven't solved it yet. We have characterized it to, I think, a very great degree. I'll repeat, one of my concerns was in those meetings in Crystal City, there was a strong impression by a large group that thought, why are we building the ISS? Let's take the money and go to Mars. And there was good credence for doing that. If we had, then we would have discovered SANS in the course of deep space missions with long transits to Mars. And people would have come back with optic disc edema and vision changes and maybe high intracranial pressure. And with a program with an inherently low flight rate and so many variabilities, it would have taken us years, if not decades, to untangle those findings. The fact that we discovered SANS on the ISS gives us an incredible characterization and a good fighting chance of understanding what it is. So a lot of that work has already been done. And we know that some of the main concerns of it, long-term vision changes, white matter degeneration, whatnot, don't seem to be a hallmark of aging astronauts. And so we can go forward with a little bit of confidence to the moon and other places, knowing that we don't really see that. And that doesn't take the urgency out of the research. But I think I see the moon, and a lot of us do, as a next step in characterizing SANS. So when you're looking at fractional gravity, every microgravity question you have on human adaptation has a threshold that goes with it. What is the threshold of either normalcy or adequate protection? And that is absolutely true of SANS, and that's one of the big research priorities we have to have in the 1.6G field of the moon. So I don't think it's going to die. I think it opens a new chapter on SANS and a whole bunch of other aspects of human adaptation.
Mike, do you think on the exploration missions we might find other things that we may need to turn around and research in low Earth orbit?
Not might, will. You know, I remember, and we had a joint panel, and I believe it was 2010. We had a lot of our Russian colleagues and our US docs, and it was all about SANS, what we called vision intracranial pressure syndrome at the time. And one of the things we ended with is this has been happening forever. We didn't see it. What's the next thing? Well, you know, we found the whole venous stasis, that sluggish flow, reverse flow in some places, in some people of circulation in the jugular vein. We found the behavior of red blood cells just recently is not at all what we thought it was. And each time you can say, what's the next thing? So yeah, what's the next thing? We've got a fabulous laboratory, and we keep finding these things serendipitously. The only risk for instance, the thrombosis that we found was signing up for the investigative study that found it, incidentally. So we will absolutely continue to find things, and we add the added factors of greater the cosmic ray, ionizing radiation exposure, fractional gravity, dust. So yeah, you need a low Earth orbit wind tunnel to help you study things in a vigorous fashion.
That actually ties back a little bit to what Mike L.A. was talking about at the beginning. And we have a question along these lines too. So as we shift gears from ISS and we start to bring some of the commercial low Earth orbit platforms online down the road and spread more into research on those panels, those platforms, how do we make sure to pass along ISS lessons learned from the way that we've been operating? And Mike, maybe you can talk a little bit about what you've been doing on the commercial side to see about ways to enable that.
I feel like a bit of a Mike.
That's a great question. Oh, I'm sorry, Mike. Maybe that was for you.
Too many mics.
Go, LA.
Okay. Look, these private astronaut missions, which is what Pam calls missions like AX-1, which are commercial ventures to the ISS, are very tightly coordinated with NASA. So we are integrated at every step of the way. And to some degree, we're learning as we go from those very lessons learned. I mean, the lessons learned after every mission at NASA get fed back into the system. And now after AX-1, Axiom has also instituted its own lessons learned process. And we now actually have a joint process with the ISS program at NASA to continue to build that database. So I think that highlights the importance of having these private astronaut missions, which among other things are there so that we can learn to operate together effectively and efficiently. And, you know, for lack of a more elegant way to say it, get to know each other well. And part of that process is learning from all the 22 years of crewed time on the ISS. Great question.
Yeah, and I guess the only thing I would add to that is that it's really, I would say, critically important that we remain a community in space medicine, space life sciences that goes across international lines and across commercial lines. We should all have a common understanding of what happens. Nobody should have to reinvent a wheel. We need to share findings. We need to do it in a careful way so that it's not attributable if we're talking medical privacy or doesn't breach proprietary lines and whatnot, but the community itself has to stay united and has to stay informed. It's, I think, important for the industry, the commercial world, and certainly important for NASA as the commercial world broadens the population base and we learn new things about the human in space.
So and this might be something LA can weigh in on. Way back in the day when both the Dragon and the Starliner were under development, what we encountered was an interesting challenge. And I don't know that we certainly didn't solve it while I was there, but it was this, this building a firewall to protect the intellectual property of the two providers. And so that actually created a situation in which, for example, one company may have had a very good solution to a problem, a design solution that would mitigate risk, but you couldn't share that with the other provider because of protecting intellectual property. And so how do we, when we talk about knowledge capture and sharing lessons learned, that works pretty well in a government program in which ostensibly the government will own the data, will own the information. But when we get into the commercial realm, now this is intellectual property. It has real value to the commercial entity. And so they rightfully don't want to lose the value, they don't want to lose a return on the investment they've made. How do we deal with that?
That is a great question, Bill. Let me just, so one of the other hats I wear is the chair of ASTM, standards development organization committee on commercial spaceflight, and we have struggled with that very thing. For example, we want to promote safety in the industry. That makes sense. And one way to do that is through industry consensus standards. Another way to do that, perhaps, is if you have, let's say, an incident, something that doesn't quite trip the level of an investigation or a mishap that's mandated under an FAA license, yet, you know, something that you didn't expect, should you be required or at least encouraged to share that information so other companies can learn from that? Now, of course, the pushback we get is that it's a small enough industry that when you start talking about especially flight operations, the vehicles are pretty disparate, and it doesn't take very long to understand, even though the data may be anonymized, you know, which vehicle it was and what happens. And so there is this, I would say it's a healthy tension between intellectual property and guarding a company's secret sauce and, you know, sort of the betterment of the industry as a whole. I can tell you that we in the commercial spaceflight industry are governed under a regime under the FAA's Office of Commercial Space Transportation, which precludes them from regulating occupant safety of vehicles for now. And the idea is that we want to give the industry time to be able to innovate before sort of the heavy hand of the FAA would come in and start mandating certain things. That regime has been extended a couple of times, and it's due to sunset at the end of this fiscal year. And so industry is quite keen to try to extend that yet again. And the way we can help convince Congress that we are able to self-regulate is to promote consensus standards across the industry. So I think that is a short answer to your question, is how do we manage that tension? I'm not sure there's an easy answer, but I think the correct path is to do it through standards.
You know, and I think actually about our experience operating ISS with multiple international partners, multiple commercial partners at this point. And we've actually had experiences where we've had to talk about anomalies or incidents that happen in one segment or on one commercial vehicle with the rest of the partnership. So maybe maybe that's another area where we can take some lessons we've learned from ISS and apply it to the broader community. Hopefully that will help. Let's see, I'm going to shift gears a little bit and think about what might be coming in the upcoming years for ISS, and start to ask folks, what are you excited about in future ISS operations and research? I'm going to start with Yelena.
I suppose that our future is it is our new results from our science, and I am absolutely sure that it will help us to be ready for moon mission, because only ISS can help us on this, and we will do it together. I am absolutely sure.
All right, Leroy.
Yeah, I'm really excited about some of the new research that's been going on in the last few years in the area of genetics and omics. And it's very exciting to me because I think what we'll find, my hunch is, being a medical layperson, is that we will find more and more things that, you know, we are kind of predisposed to either be susceptible to or resistant to. And an example would be, say, radiation exposure and the ability to recover from radiation exposure. And the corollary to that I will use is here on Earth is people who smoke. You know, we've all known people who smoke cigarettes, and, you know, some of them seem to be more susceptible to disease than others. We know that most of us know at least one person who just seems to chain smoke, but lives to a very old, ripe old age, and not too many health consequences. So I'm suspecting that some of the things we're seeing, on board with respect to SANS, with respect to other biomedical issues, I think more and more with the research we do, I'm really excited about finding out what is actually due to our genetics and our omics.
Awesome. Bill Shepard, looks like you're ready.
Yeah, I don't think it's in the cards as plans go now, but I'd like to see the space station become more of a test bed for advanced propulsion systems that could do drag makeup, and also very high power heat cycles that we will need for energy on the moon and going to Mars. Things like the solar dynamic experiment. It was originally part of the plan, but had to be dropped because we couldn't afford it at the time. I'd like to see that come back.
That would be really interesting. I'm trying to figure out where we would put that kind of a platform on the station. That would be interesting. Let's see. How about Bill MacArthur?
So I really am looking forward to seeing LA get his ISS module up there, and I'm not kidding, a little bit of kidding, but not very much. Just seeing the commercial, the sort of the metamorphosis of going from a space station that is really the purview of governments to one that more and more really is commercial. I mean, really is, no kidding, where we have private companies are truly have a business model that is broader than being under contract to a consortium of government agencies.
Amen, Bill. And I would sort of pull a little bit on what Elena mentioned. There was a film crew that made a movie on ISS last year, and it's just an example of the lines of business that are appropriately not being pursued by the government because it's not the kind of work that governments do. But to also tie back to Courtney's question more specifically, if I could expand it beyond just research, but let's say technology demonstration, NASA and investigators have focused, again, appropriately, mostly on very basic research. So it's stuff that, is to help us understand the laws of physics a little bit better when you take gravity out of the equation, et cetera. But I think what can be done now is you take the next step where you understand the process. And we started doing this a little bit with additive manufacturing, but just imagine being able to scale those processes that allow for in-space manufacturing. You've probably heard the example of fiber optic cable that can be made in microgravity conditions that's so much faster that it's actually profitable to launch the material to orbit, fabricate it there, and bring it home today. But again, the ISS it's really not the purview of the government to foment that development of manufacturing processes that someday I think is what's really going to be the moneymaker in low Earth orbit. So it's a sort of the next step in the evolution toward making products and services in space that the governments right now are, of course, restricted in a very limited swim lane.
All right. How about Mike Barrett?
Yeah, I've been trying to think how to choose my words carefully without being too provocative, but Shep's on here, so I should feel bold. I don't think we're bold enough in our human research. We've interestingly come to a point in time where we're very good at countermeasures and maintaining people for 6 months to up to a year. And we kind of expect that level of performance from them. And I think that makes us a little bit reluctant to do anything that might tip that balance. We used to do, I would say, very aggressive and extremely informative research on the shuttle, which included flying people with right heart catheters. That's a pretty gutsy thing to do, to thread a catheter into somebody's right atrium and launch them into space. We did it more than once, and it revolutionized our understanding of cardiovascular regulation. So now we have big questions. And as some of you know, we've been trying to do a telemetric intracranial pressure study in space for many years now and really haven't been able to. And so that leaves a huge understanding of our neuroophthalmic system unstudied. Interestingly, some of the folks asked us, could we ever do a spinal tap in space to look at the opening pressure? And all the docs said, of course you can. It's easy. It's simple. There's no safer place than ISS in the history of spaceflight. But the reaction by management was just so negative, and still we leave that unstudied. So I think there's no better equipped laboratory, no safer place to do some of these bold research programs that can really inform us. I mean, we do these on the ground with human subjects. I'd like to see a little bit more of that before a station gets relegated to Point Nemo. And I guess the other thing I would say is we need more systems-based research. If the last few years have taught us nothing else, there's things going on that we're not looking for. We find them serendipitously, SANS included. And so there's a lot of systems that don't seem to hurt us. And so we don't do risk-based research. I would say the GI system is incredibly understudied, but we haven't studied it because the discovery research is kind of pushed aside by risk-based research, which is where a lot of the money is. So, I mean, a corollary would be if you went to the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, and said, hey, we're going to fund your research, but only the ones that are going to lead to promising results or that are really high risk. That would take out half of NIH's budget. They do discovery science because it pays off. And so I would like to see a little bit more of that on ISS before it sunsets, or next generation LEO station. So I'll leave it with those 2 points.
Fair enough. I think we've used up all our quarters, guys. This was a really good discussion. I wanted to thank the folks that submitted questions. We didn't get to one of them, which was about a great quote from Neil deGrasse Tyson about not foreseeing missions to Mars without a motivating geopolitical force or an obvious financial return. I think that's really been the challenge of human spaceflight in general. And thinking back to how long it took to really pull together being able to fly ISS and being able to establish the partnership we have. You know, this is sort of an enduring theme with human spaceflight. It's tough to get motivated, but look at all the contributions once we get the motivation and the will to do these missions. I think it's really exciting. So I'm holding out hope that we can actually pull off a mission to Mars, and that ISS will set the foundation for what we need to get there. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Jeff. Thank you very much. This has been a lot of fun.
Thank you, Courtney, and thank you all the panelists. It's really been a terrific discussion. Okay, time to sign off and head to the next session.